Okay, welcome to another episode of the Edlow podcast. If I'm not mistaken, I became an attorney so I didn't have to do math, but I'm pretty sure this is my 30th interview. And I'm very excited, Danny, to have you come on because I don't know if you knew this really. We've known each other generally tangentially for probably 15, 20 years
Oh gosh, yeah.
over the course of time. But I have been watching you probably since I think it was right around I don't remember which anniversary show, but I was watching your friend El Flaco Loco,
Yeah,
and
friend of mine,
and
yeah.
and I got to tell you, I was at an SPW anniversary show at the Colonial Theater. The main event
Hmm.
was a death match between uh, uh, Luster and Betos Cruz, Mike Rain and Dante. He was Dante at the time, CJ.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
there was a a tag match,
Hmm.
and it was Big Ugly and Handsome Jack Dalton
Mm.
against El Flaco Loco and a mystery partner, and the mystery partner was like this chicken lucha libre guy. and and
Yeah.
and 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 I remember the match, and I remember everyone was responding to El Flaco Loco so well. Even like SPW had done like these intro promos on a big screen for
Hmm.
the show and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
And
yeah.
even and the two promos that everybody, you know, at an indie show, it's hard to get wrestling fans to kind of
Yeah.
get into it.
Hmm.
The crowd went wild when Handsome Jack Dalton and and Big Ugly came out of a car and started a promo, and everyone went crazy. And then when El Flaco Loco came on, everyone went crazy too, and that was the match that everyone went nuts for.
Yeah,
And since
that
then,
yeah,
go
that
ahead.
may have been either the second or third anniversary show
It
because
was it was probably 2003.
okay, then that may have been the third. That may have been the third
Yeah.
because SPW back then, that era of SPW only ran at the theater for about four, maybe, yeah, 4 or 5 years. I think 4 years, because then management at the theater the management at the theater at that time didn't want to have professional wrestling there anymore, and so I helped Big Ugly find a new venue, which was my old elementary school, St. Peter's, which is no
Yeah.
longer there. I mean,
Mm.
the building's there, but it's no longer an elementary school. And so then we did shows there for a number of years, and then the uh, power was transitioned to the next regime of Supreme Pro Wrestling, and they stayed there at that hall for a while, and then they moved. They're in Elk Grove now at
Yeah.
an indoor soccer. But yeah, that was it was different. As like independent wrestling fans back then are so different than, in my opinion, are so different than independent wrestling fans now. I think, in my opinion, the type of fan you were back then going to those shows are the types of fans that I love seeing at shows now. Fans that you'll see at Action Coast, fans that you'll see at Total Wrestling Federation. Because I'm always put off when I see these people who show up to independent wrestling shows only if there's a big name, a
Right.
big independent name on it, and it's
Right.
like, wait, why aren't you coming to some of the smaller shows, some of the more
Right.
independent shows, the real independent shows, not the ones that
Right.
are just bringing in the big names and flying them in and yada yada yada. There's that sector of fans that only come out if they know who's on the show. Whereas back then, it was just us. We weren't,
Yeah.
Big Ugly wasn't, paying $1,000 to fly someone in. It was just the homegrown crew of wrestlers. The furthest were coming from Fresno, and that's where you had C.J. Kurz back then wrestling as Dante. You had Professor Poindexter, Bulldog Brian
Mm.
Raymond,
Mm.
all these guys who trained in Fresno, making their way up. We were getting some wrestlers from Reno, like a very young Adam Thornstowe, a pre-tattooed Adam Thornstowe,
Yeah,
and
I remember
and
that.
and Luster. I think Luster maybe had a tattoo at the time. But I mean, very, very young. I mean, that's how early it was, but that was the furthest. And these guys were driving themselves there, And so it was a different vibe back then, and it really was an us against the world kind of vibe that Gabe Big Ugly really managed to put together there at the theater. And it was a special time of my life, and I'll never forget all of the shows that we had there. And I've told this story before of how we would have these shows on a Saturday, and then on Sunday I would meet the Big Ugly early in the morning, and we would have a bucket, some rags, and some cleaner, and we would have to clean blood off of the walls and off the floors, and just basically scrub everything down, because it was, we wanted to do another show there.
Yeah.
So we had to go back in and clean things up. And back then it was like, oh, I got to go clean up the theater, and oh, this is gross, wiping blood off the walls. But now looking back, everything's so much more romantic as you look back on it. It was like, oh, remember when we used to go scrub the blood off the walls the day after a show? And it was just like, it was a special time. And I love it. I'm glad you were at that show. That was what was his Pollo Diablo?
Yeah, that might have been it.
Devil Chicken. Yeah, he came from, because there were a couple of wrestlers who were wrestling with that gimmick. He came from Southern California. So every now and then we did get these wrestlers who came up from Southern California because they heard about this promotion that was kind of doing, kind of at the time, no one else was really doing the hardcore wrestling. And Big Ugly was a huge fan of that. And we had some pretty crazy matches. We had remember a Taipei death match where the wrestlers put their hands in glue and then put them in broken glass and punched each other with them after.
Yeah. I think I saw that one too.
That
was rough.
Yeah. There's some, and that once again, that was Handsome Jack Dalton and I think CJ Kurz or Dante back then. And
that was the first time.
Yeah.
Dante did a lot of crazy stuff. But
he did a lot of crazy stuff. Now he's doing crazier stuff. I don't know if you follow CJ now. He does the strongman.
I saw that.
So like every now and then it's cool. Every now and then he'll come back into the wrestling ring, but it just blows me away. I'll see this guy, lifting a big, giant boulder that's like 300 pounds and tossing it, and like only CJ.
Yeah, he's a funny guy. So I don't know if I've ever told you my connection to SPW, but so Rich Roby, who was running the place before, and I don't know, what year did you kind of come into SPW?
I got involved on their third show. I went so I remember Rich Roby and Mark Tornatore, and they're the one, they brought me in. I went to the very first show. It was called Sacramento Pro Wrestling.
Yeah, I was on that show. I wrestled
you were
on that show.
Okay. I remember. I went to that show. Because I grew up in that neighborhood, and that theater. I used to go see Cantinflas films in that theater. It was kind of like the Mexican Charlie Chaplin kind of, and Buster Keaton type of comedian. And so I used to see old movies there as a kid, and I was so excited when I saw wrestling on the marquee. Growing up loving wrestling, and it's in my neighborhood. And I remember going to see it, and it was rough. It wasn't this smooth running show that went right on time. I remember the show started late. The show was like, it had a set time of like, I want to say like 7 o'clock, and it's like 7:30, and the show hasn't started. But there was that appeal to the punk rock side of me that was like, I like it. There's some rough edges here. It's this is real to me. This is like down to earth. And then I went to I think the second show was called Supreme Pro Wrestling, and I was involved with a wrestling promotion called Incredibly Strange Wrestling in San Francisco, and we were wrestling like at the Fillmore. There would be like a band wrestling, and then a band, and no one was trained. Trained, and we all had crazy, wild gimmicks. And when you walked into the theater, you got a stack of corn tortillas, and you would throw them at the wrestlers. So the wrestlers would just be covered. We'd be quote unquote wrestling in this corn tortilla covered ring slipping and falling all over the place. It would take like a week to wash that cornmeal out of your wrestling gear. But I was, and I use it in quotations because I wasn't trained. I was wrestling in front of over 1,000 people, going crazy. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I remember putting together a tape, and at that second show, I kind of judging, okay, who's kind of in charge, and it kind of seemed like there was this guy named the Big Ugly.
Yeah.
There was something that he had there was an aura about him, like, this is the guy who's in charge.
Yeah.
And so I remember getting a tape to him. I say, hey, introduce myself. Hey, my name is Danny. This is what I do. And I gave him the tape. And I'm expecting him to just like roll out the red carpet and say, please come in, take, because it's this tape of me having these wrestling matches in front of 1,000 people at the Fillmore with tortillas flying everywhere and crazy gimmicks. And his response was, you're horrible as a wrestler, but you're good on the mic. But you're pretty good on the mic, so I'll train you if you want. And that was not the reaction I was expecting. I was not expecting to hear how bad I was. I was expecting to hear how great I was. I was like, please tell me how fantastic. But he gave me a great dose of reality. And there was something about that, I've got this thing where I'm wrestling in front of 1,000 people, huge, huge shows. But then there's this small, independent, rough around the corners, rough, punk rock type of promotion in my own hometown. And I was drawn to that. I was like, I want to do this one. I want to do the one that's not the big production and with thousands of people and all that. I want to do this small, homegrown, rough around the corners type of product. And so then I started training with Gabe, and originally started training in Stockton, because he was running his wrestling school in Stockton. And the deal was he was training these students in Stockton who owned a ring. And the deal was he would train them if they would bring the ring for his shows. And so that was kind of the deal that they had there. And so I was paying the people who owned the ring, which was back then they were called RPW, Revolutionary Pro Wrestling.
Dave
I was
Touchstone,
paying them.
right?
Yeah, Dave Touchstone. And who would be a great guest. He's hilarious. He's a stand-up comedian.
I love him.
And so I started training through them, and it was great. I loved that experience. It was this musty old warehouse that reminds me so much of where Next Level Pro Wrestling trains right now. It's just this old warehouse on the wrong side of the tracks, and there's a lot of great things happening in there. And there's so much about the warehouse where Next Level trains and where Next Level runs shows that reminds me of that old warehouse where I started training with the Big Ugly and Dave Touchstone and all these other wrestlers like Jesus the Brown Snake Cruz and El Pachuco and Mr. GSWA Baby Ray and Joe Average and Wicked and all these guys from the early days of SPW. And that's why I fell in love with Next Level, because it reminds me so much of that.
It's so funny you bringing up. It's so funny you bringing up all those names, because they just bring so much memory. So my small part of SPW was I was running a backyard fed called SWF, right? And I had been getting on all over the TV, all the news stations, because backyard wrestling was huge back then, Yeah. And so Rich calls me up, because Rich had no idea what he was doing either, right? He just wanted to get into wrestling. So he calls me and he goes, hey, why don't you come work with me? And I'd had other promoters call me and just they knew I could get TV cameras, so they would call me, but they weren't really serious. Yeah. So I go, how do I know that you're legit? And he goes, meet me at this address, and it was the Colonial Theater. And he goes, I want to put wrestling in here once a month. And I go, okay. And he goes, and I want you to run it. And I said, I had only trained for 2 months. I trained with Oliver John, and I trained
at Pro-I-Am.
At Pro-I-Am, yeah. So that's funny that you bring up Next Level. That's right down the street from where Pro-I-Am was.
It's right around the. I remember going to this conversation just keeps going backwards and backwards in time. I used to work at a video store called Cinemania.
Oh,
and
nice.
we specialized in B movies and horror movies and martial arts. And we had a wrestling section, and they let me curate our wrestling video section. And there was basically this warehouse where you can get old you can buy all the old VHS tapes from other video stores that they got rid of, and then so we'd buy them and then we'd rent them out. And we had one of the bigger wrestling selections in Sacramento, and so I kind of
Nice.
prided myself in that. And there was one customer who would come in, really big guy, and he was a big fan. He's like, "Oh my gosh, you have this wrestling, you have this wrestling movie, you have this pay-per-view, you have all these papers." And then he started telling me about where he was training, and he told me about Pro I Am, and I remember the business card he gave me, and I went to go visit them just to go see what it was, because this is like right before I started getting involved with Incredibly Strange Wrestling. I wanted to see, what's this like, and I remember meeting Oliver John. He was in the ring working with a few wrestlers. You might have been in there, because
Yeah, I might have been one of them.
There's about 5 or 6 guys there. But the gentleman who I was introduced to was
Paul DeMarco?
Yeah, Paul DeMarco.
Yeah.
I met, but like you can kind of tell Paul DeMarco's like he wasn't really involved in the training. He was there. Paul DeMarco has done so much in pro wrestling. I mean, he is California wrestling history.
Right.
But I remember him showing me this lampshade that he was like into making lamps and lampshades.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you got to check out this lamp. And I'm like looking at you guys flying around the wrestling room. Yeah. And he's like, yeah, look at this lampshade that I was making. I don't know if you remember, he was like into making lampshades or.
Yeah, he was into a lot of sort of weird stuff.
And so he was all interested in telling me about that. And then I remember meeting Oliver John, but he was the one running the training. And I just went there once, and it was to me at the time, it was so big, and I felt so tiny. And I was like, "There's no way I can do this. There's no way." And I never went back. But I always wonder, it's like, oh, what if I just went back and worked with Oliver, and then where could that have taken me then? But so it's like, and that's literally right around the corner from where Next Level is right now. So
and that's where I met Justin. I met him because he trained at Pro AM for a while. And so that's where I met him. We kind of started. I think we started right around the same time. I can't remember which one of us came in there first. But you obviously weren't there on the day when Tom Bocci was there, because Tom Bocci was there, and he was about 12 years old when he was training, and he was so tiny. And but anyway, so I was like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing. Like I do a backyard show, sure, but I don't know like this is like real wrestling. You know what I mean? And so I knew Hustler, and I knew Big Money.
The 8 Ball Posse.
Yeah, I knew the 8 Ball Posse because they had kind of recruited me. They saw my wrestling stuff, and they wanted me to come work a show that Warpath was putting on. And so I knew them, and I had gone down to Hard Times and talked to them a few times. So I got Rich involved with Hustler, and then Hustler introduced him to Cooley, and I was like, oh, that's not it. I was like, whoops. And so, but the funny thing about that was, so I'm the one who found RPW online because we were looking for a ring and I didn't have one. And so I saw RPW, and I'd had another guy one time in Modesto say he had a ring, and I went there and it was not a ring. And so I emailed him like, do you have a ring? Because if you have a legitimate ring, I want to talk to you about putting together like a business arrangement type thing.
Okay.
And it was Dave Touchstone. And he goes, yes, I have an actual real ring. And I said, okay, so I'm bringing guys down to see you. These are real wrestlers. So if you're not telling me the truth, they're going to be really mad at me. So please. And so he's like, no, I do. And we walked in. It was me and Cooley, a friend of mine, Gil, who wrestled with me, and Hustler and Big Money. And we all went down there, and that's where I met Jesus Cruz. Wicked was there. Dave Touchstone. Baby Ray. Baby Ray was I thought of all the guys there, watching him work, I was like, that's the guy that's going to make it farthest.
Mr. GSWA Baby Ray. Ray was such a great guy.
He really was.
He's still with us. No, man, he was such an amazing worker. But he was like the one who's like, yeah, we're just you watch him in the ring, where it's like, yeah, we're kind of not on the same level as him.
Yeah,
he's right up there. He was something that, and and who knows? It's like the landscape of independent wrestling was so different in around 2000 than it is now. And if Mr. GSWA Baby Ray was at the age and the level where he was back then, today, he'd probably be one of those guys who was wrestling on AEW Dark.
Oh, no joke.
Golden One. He would be on these West Coast shows that are bringing in all the big names. That's in my opinion, that's the level that Mr. GSWA Baby Ray was at.
I remember him coming. He put on his singlet, and so with that, Rich was like, "Well, how are we going to get the ring up there?" And so I talked to the guys, and they'd never done any shows ever. And Hustler and Cooley and those guys went in there and started training them a little bit, showing them some stuff. So they had a deal. They were like, well, we'll come and do it if we get to be on the show. And, of course, Rich is like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And I pitched. I said, well, why don't we do this? I'll pay for the U-Haul, but we need to do because I was doing monthly backyard shows and drawing like 250, right? I was drawing big numbers.
Without a ring?
Without a ring?
Wow.
Without a ring, yeah. So, in fact, most of the people said they liked it better without the ring, which was interesting. But anyway, so I said, I want to do a show with a ring at night. We'll book all your guys on the show. We'll put the show together. My guys, your guys. We'll do a Battle Royal too. And we did. And so the night before the first SPW show, I did a backyard show. Cops may have been called, but so, and I think he's okay with me sharing this now. It's a different landscape, but that is where I met Big Ugly. Big Ugly's first match was in my backyard, and his second match was on SPW. He says his first match was SPW, but his first match was actually in my backyard. And
he showed up with the hit squad, right?
Yeah, he did.
But
the thing that was funny about that was, so we're all backyarders. I mean, I was the most trained of everybody. Right. And I was not anywhere near, ready. I would just get bookings because I'm 6'7", I'm gigantic. So people, I don't have to do much. Yeah. But he got in there and he did a blockbuster off the top rope on this guy. And when he hit that, I was like, me and my buddy Gil looked at each other and were like, that guy actually, he's a wrestler. He's legit, and and then we did the show. I ended up working that show, Big Money. And then Ugly worked. I can't remember the guy's name, but he kind of looked like a combination between Hawk and Draws. He wore like a big fancy, like big hat, and he kind of painted his face like a road warrior.
I was Kid Looney.
That's it, Kid Looney. That's who it was.
Yeah.
And the only guys that came up for Fresno from that show was that, and it was Dante versus Professor Poindexter. And I remember being
one of my favorite gimmicks, by the way. Professor
It was
Poindexter,
so good.
One of my favorite.
It was so good. Oh, it was so good. And we had some APW guys there too. But I distinctly remember, I remember both of the matches for different reasons. I remember Ugly and Looney going out there and they just tore the house down. I mean, they just tore the house down. It was a completely different level on anything else that was on the show. Yeah. And then Poindexter and Dante, the reason I remember that one was because Cooley did not like that the Fresno guys were there. He wanted he just wanted his guys there. And, look, Ugly was jacked, and so was Kid Looney. He was pretty good, looked pretty good.
Yeah, Looney was a pretty good guy.
Yeah, and other than Warpath and Hustler, the rest of them didn't look like that. And Cooley could kind of see the writing on the wall. Right, he wanted to keep the power. He was the booker, so Dante's working his match with Poindexter, and it's all of their first match. And 2 minutes in, he's calling for the he's waving the pencil, right? So Dante just didn't listen, and he kept working. He worked I think it was a 15-minute match, right?
Yeah.
And we're all back there. I'm like, all right, well. But the match was great. It was fantastic. And
because Looney, Ugly, Poindexter, and CJ Dante, they all trained under Brian Ward in Fresno. Brian Ward, who is a Heart Dungeon graduate.
Right.
So they're all, so they all were very familiar with one another, and and not to take away from anything that they did in the match, but they had that opportunity if they were training together. Ugly and Looney would drive down. They were, I want to say, maybe Looney was Bay Area and Ugly was West Sacramento, and they would drive down to Fresno and train. And CJ and Poindexter were both lived in Fresno, and they trained, and so they had an opportunity to get a feel for each other in the ring, and not necessarily can out anything that they're going to do, but to be familiar with one another in the ring. I think that was super important. I think that's one of the best things about training, is getting that opportunity to work with other people.
Yeah, well, they were great. They did a great job. But when they came back, Dante, he Cooley didn't cause a scene or nothing, but he just said something, which I think he was right. He said, "Hey, look, I understand that this was your first match, but just when a booker tells you to go home, you go home."
Yeah.
And Dante did not respond. Dante responded as a Dante would.
Yeah.
And he got tossed out. And and Ugly was like, "Yeah, you should probably go home," and he did. And then they tried to kick Ugly out, and Ugly's like, I'm not going anywhere. And he didn't leave. And so there were, and so that was my experience with all my first experience with all of them. Yeah. I came back, so I left on a mission. I was there for 2 more shows, and then I went on a mission, and I came back 2 years later, and then that's when I had heard Rich passed away. Yeah. And the Ugly had the book, and Ugly, and looking back now, I don't know if I've ever talked about this with Gabe too much, but like, he really rubbed me the wrong way when I came back. And but looking back, I realized he was under a lot of pressure from like APW, and there was a big kind of everyone was calling them backyarders and all this stuff. I was a literal backyarder, you know what I mean? So he probably didn't want me around much, because that's what my view was. But I remember going to those shows, and there was a legit feel at that time in SPW where I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, if this has the possibility of getting really big, and all the workers were so good. You know what I mean? Like, it was from 2000 when I saw it, where the workers were there was a big difference between guys like Hustler and Big Money, who'd been around a long time and they could work, and these younger guys. I could see that we were on the cusp of a really great scene,
Yeah, and keep in mind that this is also before social media.
Yeah.
All that, as far as the internet was concerned, if there was board host, yet there were message boards.
Yeah.
And if you had a website, and if someone had internet, dial-up internet, they can go to said website. But prior to that, it was handbills, sticking a flyer in someone's hand, word of mouth. I remember the locker room was interesting, because you had your section of the locker room that was the Big Money, the Hustlers, and the Warpaths, and the 8-Ball Posse, and then everyone else was was down the hall in another area. And it's not like there was any friction in between it, but I remember how Big Money in particular was always willing to pass on the knowledge and pass on the advice. And he was the one that would always say, "Hey man, you got to slow down. Don't do too much." And it's like, "Hey, you got to maybe don't talk so often when you're out there, when you're out there and you're not in the match." And so I always appreciated Bill for that. He was definitely one that was willing to cross that bridge to talk to the younger guys. And not that the other ones were standoffish, but we weren't really the kind that would reach out and say, "Hey, can you give me some advice?" I never approached Warpath and said, "Hey, can you watch my match and give me some advice?" Or I never approached Hustler or any of those guys. Yeah. But Bill would always come forward and say, "Hey, let me tell you what you should try next time. Let me try." And then we're young and dumb, and it's like, "Oh, we don't want to listen to anyone," and whatnot. But it was really important that, looking back, I'm like, I want to be like like Bill.
Yeah.
I'm at the point where it's like, sometimes the younger wrestlers aren't going to come to me. And it's like, I don't do much, so they may not feel comfortable coming to me or feel like they need to come to me. But if I can approach one of the younger guys and say, hey, maybe try this or try that, whether it garners a reaction or not, maybe years from now, they'll be feeling the same way I feel about big money towards me, which is a really special thing. It's like, I don't know if Bill knows that, 20 years later, I'd still remember him reaching out and offering advice and how important that was, how special that was. And, guys like Bill Monroe, Rich Roby, those are names that don't get mentioned very often. We talked about the history and the lineage of California wrestling. Or we mentioned Paul DeMarco, or I brain farted. I couldn't remember Paul DeMarco, but it's like, that's one of the guys that we need to know about. How Paul DeMarco was so pivotal in helping develop wrestlers in our local independent scene. But then a guy like Rich Roby, for years after he passed, we had the Rich Roby Cup, which was a battle royal that we would have at the anniversary, and then that kind of faded away, and that made me really sad. That Rich Roby was an important part of my involvement in my local wrestling scene. And
Rich Roby was the first guy who gave me an actual shot of being a legit. I mean, he put me in a match with Hustler for the SPW Championship, match 2. And it was like, I was not ready for that, and Hustler was not happy about that, but like, I shouldn't say that. He actually, after the match, had a lot of great things to say. And so did, and that's the thing, like, these guys, you're right, like Rich Roby, SPW doesn't really happen in the way that it happened without him. And
without Rich or Mark, or any of the guys who like you were saying, and it was that genesis of that era that was so important, and it was so vital, and it really wasn't us against the world, and the landscape of independent wrestling, in my opinion, was so different back then. Right now, you've got people working together. We've got 10 different promotions in Sacramento, and they all share the same roster pretty much.
Right.
But back then, no one really worked together. I mean, we definitely didn't work together with APW.
Right.
It was APW was up here. They were the upper echelon, and they made sure to let everyone know. And you had SPW and RPW and NAW kind of working together. RPW did shows in Stockton, SPW did shows at the Colonial Theater, and we kind of worked together. And then this new promotion showed up in Yuba City called PCW, and there were other promotions here or there. You had TWF. I always loved TWF even before they had a wrestling ring. When they started in was it 98? They started in 98, and they were on TV. They were doing the cable
public access thing.
And Jake is another one. It's like, that guy doesn't get a tenth of the credit he deserves for everything he's done for wrestling.
Right.
And the fact that he's at the level where he's at now, that and to me, it's such a beautiful story where that's what he's at the Colonial Theater, and the vibe in the locker room at those shows from TWF reminds me so much of 2000 Colonial Theater wrestling shows. It's the same vibe. And I remember the first TWF show I was at, and I was back in the locker room, and I just got this overwhelming wave of nostalgia. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like I get to go back in the day and relive everything, and relive that vibe and that attitude, that us against the world kind of vibe that I fell in love with when Gabe brought me in, when I was working with Gabe and Dave Touchstone and Rich Roby, and it's that same type of vibe with Jake at TWF, and it's awesome. It's absolutely awesome. And
it's so cool to see him do what I think because they started out as a backyard fed. I remember they were there. I was actually kind of jealous because they had public access. I was the one who was getting on all the radio and TV stations. Yeah. But they were on TV every week. And so it was, but he has done with TWF what everyone who ever started a backyard promotion thought that they would love to have done, and actually made it legit.
Yeah.
You know, and made it a legit promotion that runs and has a following, and their guys are actually trained and they're wrestlers, and they were kind of in 2002, 3, even earlier in 2000, they were kind of the laughing stock, you know, like everyone kind of made fun of them.
They were, and you know, and it was, and I sympathized with that because, you know, when I was working with Dave and Dave Touchstone, we were the laughing stock. There was a group in the Bay Area that was laughing and making fun of us. But then the buzz started picking up, and they're like, oh, but now you want to come work. You want to come work with us? You want to come? You want to come? You want to come to the theater? You're hitting up Big Ugly now. You're hitting up Dave Touchstone now. It's like when, you know, you're on the message boards, you're not saying so many nice things about us. But, and it's kind of, and so like I've always, it was hard for me to join in on that bandwagon of making fun of TWF and making fun of the backyarders when that's what we were being called by other people. You know, it's kind of like, you know, the you know, we're being abused, so we're going to abuse someone in return. But it's like, I didn't want to get involved in any of that. And I've always thought, you know, it's like, damn it, these guys are having so much fun. How could you not respect it? They're doing it for the love. And so the fact that, you know, I think one of my biggest regrets is that it took me so long to hop on to the TWF train because I've always loved what Jake was doing, even when it was without a ring, when they were wrestling on play structures. When it was Tracy Wrestling Federation, I used to watch that on, and he's still doing it for the love. I mean, he's a one-man wrecking crew. He's filming it, he's editing it, he's booking it, he's writing the storylines, he's promoting it, he's doing everything, and it's infectious, and it just it's kind of nice to just sit back and just like be around someone that creative.
It's amazing what he's done over there. You know, you brought up, so you used to, first of all, you had my dream job. I worked at Blockbuster for a while, and but I always loved. I told a story when Stephen Kyoto came on. There was across the street from the Blockbuster I worked at was a place called 99 Cent Video Clearance Center in Carmichael. And they were very similar to Cinemania. They had all the old stuff, and man, that's where I ran into. I mean, I saw all the trauma movies. I saw Killer Clowns, and all of those things. And so you seem to me as somebody. It's so funny because you're a middle school teacher.
I teach 8th grade.
Yeah, you teach 8th grade, but then also you are just so into so much counterculture stuff, and it's just so cool. Like, and I love it. Like, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about it, like you've been in a punk rock, multiple punk rock bands, right? You know, you've got this friend Del Flaco Loco that
he's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, a good friend of yours.
He's a neighbor of mine.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you're into like martial arts and horror movies and things like that. Like, where did all this come from?
I think it's just, as a kid, I grew up in a very traditional Mexican Catholic household. My father was a Roman Catholic deacon. Wow. I was an altar boy. You know, I went to Catholic school. And so so there's that part of me that wanted to rebel a little bit against that. But I remember as a kid, getting into the horror movies as a kid, I remember Creature Feature with Bob Wilkins.
Oh, yeah.
And that would be on really late at night. And I remember specifically, like, after everyone's asleep, sneaking back into the living room, turning on the TV, there wasn't a remote, turning on the TV, lowering the volume and kind of adjusting it so it was a little darker and watching what I thought were scary movies, but now in retrospect, no, they were just B movies. But so I got it. So it was that this is taboo. I'm not supposed to be up this late watching movies. So that got me into that. And then the wrestling side of things, especially with the mass wrestling, it was to get in touch with my Mexican culture, because by the time my parents are both they both from Mexico. And when my sister was born, she grew up speaking Spanish. And then my oldest brother was born Spanish. And then when my other brother was born Spanish, a little bit of English. A number of years later, a surprise came about. And by that time, English was the primary language in my household, and my family had already been, for lack of a better term, Americanized. And so I always felt a disconnect to my Mexican culture. And so that's why when I first started, I remember the first time I watched wrestling on TV, and I was just, oh my gosh, what is this? And the wrestler that stood out to me was Mil Mascaras. And it was the Mexican wrestlers wearing a mask, and so the pageantry and all that, and that drew me in. And so that's why I've always, as far as wrestling is concerned, why I've always been drawn towards the mass wrestling and the history of Lucha Libre, because that part of me that feels insecure about not being super in touch with my Mexican heritage, I feel like this is an avenue where I can get in touch with that, and why that's so important to me. But as far as the music side of things, it's just just discovering it on my own. I think the thing was, no one forced it down my throat. I didn't have an older brother saying, hey, you got to listen to this. One of my older brothers listened to Queen. Another one of my older brothers listened to Styx and Rush. My sister listened to Foreigner and Bread. And then the first time I heard the Ramones, I'm like, oh, this is it. This is what I want, and this is what I love. And so I think what got me into that counterculture was just discovering it on my own. And I think so often now, especially with, I hate to blame things on social media and technology, but I think so much is force-fed that things aren't discovered the way that they were. So I remember the moment I discovered wrestling. I remember the moment I first heard the Ramones. I mean, I'd seen them, but like the first time I really heard it and it hit me, it just hit me like a lightning bolt right to the heart. And so it's the moment of discovery. The first time I remember that moment of watching, a horror movie late at night when I'm not supposed to be watching, the thrill and the excitement. And so that when you discover it, it's real, it's genuine. And in my case, so far, it's been lifelong, with punk rock, with horror movies, with wrestling and that counterculture. And I think that's why I was more attracted to the rough edge, grungier side of independent wrestling rather than the big 1,000 people in the Fillmore Theater side of wrestling.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's funny. There's a lot of similarity. We have a lot of similarities I grew up in a Mormon household, but my dad was Jewish and converted over, and it was but it was a long transition from actually becoming, like, getting baptized Mormon and then actually really following, and then all of our extended family is either Catholic or Jewish or nothing, and so like I was introduced to a lot of things just because my dad wasn't traditionally Mormon. I think I was introduced to a lot of things that Mormon kids normally weren't. He was really big into music, so I was always listening to The Who and listening to, he was big into the Doobie Brothers and stuff like that. And then I started getting into, Guns N' Roses and Metallica. That was kind of my area, and then, but yeah, he was the one. My dad and my aunt were the ones who took me to my first wrestling show. And I went to the Arco Arena. My first live show was at the Arco Arena, the British Bulldogs against the Dream Team in a cage. And
oh my gosh.
And it was the first time I'd seen anybody bleed, including the baby faces. Usually it was the bad guy who was always bleeding. Hogan never bled. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I remember I lost my voice. I think I was 4 years old. And screaming for so long, and I just was immediately hooked. But the movies, I had a couple of friends who in 7th grade, they just were really into B movies, and we'd have these sleepovers, and they'd be like, "Yeah, you got to see this," and I was like, "What is this? What is this craziness that I'm watching?" They'd be like, "Watch this. It's called Surf Nazis Must Die. You'll love it." And I'll be like, "Okay," and we watch it, and I'd be like, I don't know what we're watching, but I'm kind of into it. But I got to ask you, have you seen Velocipaster?
I have not seen Velocipaster. Okay.
You, sir, need to go on Amazon Prime.
Of pastor and Velociraptor?
Yes, check this out. It is a pastor who turns into a dinosaur and fights crime with a sidekick who is a hooker but also a pre-med law student. And I got to tell you, I have been begging, I have been sending messages to Brendan Steer, who directed this, to come on this podcast, and he has eluded me so far because I got to ask how this man came up with this genius idea. It's great.
All right, I mean, it's.
You got to see it. You got to see it. It's on Amazon. If it's still there, it's on Amazon Prime.
Okay,
And,
all right, right.
And if not, I have it on Blu-ray, sir. I will lend you a copy.
Awesome. Awesome. I have to hit up I still keep in touch with my friend RJ who ran Cinemania. And so I'll see if he's heard of Velocipaster. And I mean, you never know. He was so involved in the B movie scene. He may even know the director of that film. So he was pretty involved in it. That sounds like the type of movie that we would have had there. Like our horror movies section at Cinema was broken up by director. Our martial arts was broken up by director. That's how extensive it was.
Wow.
It was a wild time, and we used to do live window displays. I remember one of the first times my friend El Flaco Loco was a live window display, and he had a chair, a TV with the videotape playing mass Mexican wrestling, and he was drinking, and he drank a 12-pack of Tecate while eating pork rinds. and he was in full wrestling gear, and as customers were walking past the window, he would give them the one-fingered salute and upset people. And people were like, why is this guy wearing a mask and tights and drinking and giving rude gestures to people walking past? And so that's the type of place Cinemania was. And I mean, if it was around today, it would have been a phenomenon. But back then, it was just like, it's just a video store. It's like I can get it cheaper at Blockbuster, or, Hollywood Video and things like that. But
I don't think kids understand how awesome video stores were. They were
and just remember like going into video stores and you'd see the box and then like, but there's no video behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, just out of stock.
Yeah. I was trying to tell my son and his buddy, he came over and stayed the night at my place, and I was telling them, I was like, man, our weekend was just, we would go to Blockbuster and we would wait for the new release to come through the slot or whatever.
Yeah.
And then once it did, you were stoked. You'd get a Little Caesars pizza. You'd chow down on pizza and watch a couple of movies. If you were lucky, your mom let you get a video game too. And you just, you know what I mean? And that was your weekend, man. And it was great. And those were good times.
Yeah. And it's kind of, and I think kids today, they have their own thing of socializing, and that we don't get, that I definitely don't understand, and I've given up trying to understand. As an 8th grade teacher, I'm so comfortable not being able to relate to my students, and they're comfortable not trying to relate to me, so it's totally fine. But yeah, that thrill of like, Friday night, we're gonna go rent a movie.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't make that sound cool, but it was the coolest thing. It's like,
I know,
we're going to get 2 movies, and then we're going to get, and then the like Little Caesar pizza, and it's like, and then we're going to get the big 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew, and
you'd be up all night.
Yeah, and that was so much fun, and but it's things like that those experiences that I think that you find in independent wrestling, in independent music, in independent filmmaking. I think they're still there. They're just, it just takes a little more time to notice it and appreciate it. Because like you're sitting there talking about your first wrestling show, I'm automatically, I start thinking, I didn't want to get on, my first wrestling, but it's like, when you start telling someone about your first wrestling show, automatically they're thinking of their first wrestling show. They're thinking of the first time they saw someone and the first interaction they have with the wrestler. You start talking about music, and then you start making those connections of that in person, that live experience. And to me, that's why I love that.
What I love about, I think my favorite thing about being involved in wrestling has been that I don't think I would have ever had such a cool, diverse group of friends any other way. You know, being a Mormon guy from Carmichael, the ghettos of Carmichael, California, you know, like I wouldn't have met, like, you know, I had Chic, Dark Chic on the podcast, and you know, I don't think there's anybody I know more diverse than Dark Chic, being a transgender woman who runs Hood Slam, you know, with a Muslim background. I mean, that's really, you know, that's shocking.
Talk about an uphill. Talk about someone with an uphill battle, all around, and the amount of success she has had, not just as just being the mastermind behind one of the most incredible independent wrestling promotions, but as an independent wrestler herself, traveling all over and being in demand, and just what a creative force. And you know, and for those of us who were lucky enough to have known her for so many years and seen that transition and how they just continue to be a force of creativity and a force of positivity as well. I mean,
and giving so many people a chance that otherwise didn't have them. You know, I mean, there's a lot of workers out there now who they command a high price because of Hood Slam, because of what she put together. But that's what I'm saying. Like I remember when I did, you know, for a while we did the stuff. I did some stuff with TNA Impact, and I was on a tour with them in Washington, and I remember sitting there with a guy, and I was helping out at the end. You know, they used my ring, and I was helping out with the meet and greet in the back, and I was talking to, I think it was Bob Rosen, who he's now the ring guy for AEW, but we were sitting there talking, and all these people walked by. And they just were so, I was like, you know, I was in law school at the time and had, you know, a bunch of kids. And I go, I would not know these people. Like all of these people now, we can talk about something and have something in common. There's nothing else in common we have. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet I can sit there for hours and talk about the matches that made me, that I remember, and things that are really special to me, and they'll connect with somebody through that. And I imagine you feel the same way about music.
Yeah. I mean, there's in both in the world of music and world of wrestling, I've had an opportunity to meet tons of people. With music, especially, I've been able to tour the U.S. about 6 times, full U.S. tours, toured Europe twice. And got to, you know, it's like there's definitely played those shows where I'm like, how did I end up here?
Yeah.
What, you know, but then again, the parallels between music and wrestling. I was at a point in my life where I was playing in one band. We're playing in front of hundreds of people every night, and people are going crazy for the shows and yada, yada, yada. But then I started enjoying myself more playing with a side project at the time, which is now my main band, but my side project is, you know, the intimacy, the connection I was having with the people I was making music with, and that us against the world kind of feeling to it. But yeah, music and wrestling, it's filled with creative people. In my opinion, the wrestling side, the people involved with wrestling don't get the credit for the creativity that they have. You know, that just, as I'm sure you know, it's like so often people they use the F word when they're talking about wrestling, and so they discredit everything that they do,
right?
You know, because it's, you know, fake or whatever term they want to say. But they would never say that to a Broadway actor.
Right.
They would never say that to someone winning an Academy Award. They would never say that to someone on stage. They would never discredit what they do or take away from any of their creativity. But the world of wrestling is just, you know, I'm sitting here in my guitar room and I've got like Bobby Heenan, Ox Baker, Mr. Wrestling 2. You know, I've got these posters and the Destroyer, and I'm like, man, you want to talk about creative people?
Yeah.
You know, it's like people who've given so much.
And it's so, what I also think people don't realize about wrestling is there's so many different styles, and there's so many different things that can elicit emotion.
Like music.
Yeah, I mean, I like for me personally, the wrestling that impresses me the most. Like you watched, we recently had a match in the WWE. I think it was Elimination Chamber where Sami Zayn worked Roman Reigns,
Yeah.
and they've been building that story up for a year and a half. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And they're doing it in Sami Zayn's hometown. You know,
Hmm.
he shows up, and man, they didn't do anything. Like as far as actually moves,
Yeah.
they didn't have to do anything, and the crowd ate it up.
They had him
And
right there.
yeah, and it's just to me you think about like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, where these two guys are in front of 90,000 people. They just got through seeing Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat do a 45-minute just absolute masterpiece of
Clinic.
a match. Yeah.
Clinic. Yeah.
It was just a straight up masterpiece. Crowds going crazy, and they're just as crazy for punches, a body slam, and a leg drop.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's just amazing that people can that you can get that much emotion from a story like that. And same with music. I mean, there are songs where you'll listen to them and you'll feel sad, you'll feel excited,
Hmm.
you'll want to punch someone in the face. You know, you have all these
Yeah.
different types of music that just elicit so much
And,
emotion.
in my opinion, it takes courage on the side of the audience to allow themselves to get involved with that. To me, that's why independent music and independent wrestling shows are so important, because it's right there, it's in your face. Um, but it takes courage to allow yourself to get invested in the story of it. If you didn't have the courage to get invested into that story of Sami Zayn and Roman Reigns, you would have been sitting there waiting. When are they going to do a 450? When are
Yeah.
we going to see blood? But you're invested in the story. You're invested with every emotion that Sami Zayn's face is emitting. With music, the same way. If you're like, okay, when are you going to do a solo? When are we going to see the guitar
Mm.
go on fire or whatever? But if you're into the emotion of the music, the power, the drive, it doesn't have to be anything super complicated. Like with me and the Ramones, it was just the drive and the
Mm.
intensity. It was like a cup of coffee in a minute and a half, with
Mm.
that music. Um, I've got every week I do a journal entry with my class,
Mm.
and it's usually based on a TED talk.
Mm.
And there's the one that we're going to be doing tomorrow. It's about the power of classical music, essentially.
Mm. Mm.
And he's playing this piece, and it's like, it's a beautiful piece, but if you're not into classical, they say, maybe 3% of the public is into classical music, but he challenges the listener to listen to this piece differently. He's like, before I play it, I want you to think about someone that you care about who's no longer with us.
Mm.
And just think of them. Think of them. And that takes a lot of courage. I mean, because you say, yeah, I'm thinking that. And just play the music. Okay, yeah, I didn't like it. But if you take the time to put yourself into it, and you put your heart into this, like I thought of my mom,
Mm.
and I'm listening to this music, and I'm just welling up with tears, because I'm able to take my feelings and my emotion and put it into this beautiful piece of classical music. And that takes
Yeah.
courage when you take something that's inside of you and you put it into the art that's in front of you. The storytelling of the wrestling, with Hogan and Andre, it's like as a kid you grew up and like these were two giants in wrestling that never had a reason to collide, but then all of a sudden there was this deception and this betrayal from Andre the Giant, the all-time greatest of the good guys, betrayed his pupil, his protege.
Yeah.
And so you have this, like, if you got into the story of just like, if you've ever been betrayed, or if you've ever felt like you were stabbed in the back by someone that you looked up to, you were all about Hulk Hogan finally beating that giant. But that takes courage for the audience member to put themselves in the story that's being presented for them. And I think wrestling fans who get into it, not the ones who sit there with their arms crossed waiting for the flips, Those wrestling fans irritate me. The ones who only go to certain wrestling shows when there's a big name and they pay the extra money to get the ringside seat and they sit there like this the whole time, leaning back in their chair, waiting to be impressed. Those aren't the fans that I really enjoy seeing at shows. I like the ones who are sitting forward. They're up there. It doesn't matter if there's only 10 people in the audience, but they're into it. They're cheering. They're getting into the match. They're booing who they want to boo. They're cheering who they want to boo. That's taking courage on their part to get involved in it. And it's the same thing with music. You have people at shows who are just sitting there, okay, listening to it. And then you have other people who are really getting into it. They're getting into the drive, the passion, the power of whatever music that they're listening to. And so that TED Talk where he challenges the listener to really, he gives them a really simple tool. Think about someone who's no longer here. Now listen to this. Yeah. And you can't help but be overrun with emotion. Yeah.
Well, man, that sounds awesome. You how long have you been teaching now?
I am up, we're looking at 28, 29 years. I lose track. I lose track of it. I started teaching fresh out of college. Pretty much fresh cut right out of college. And so coming up on 30 years now. Years. I did day-to-day substitute teaching in the public school. And then I got a second grade position. I did that for about 12 years or so. And then I did a fourth grade position, did that for about 12 years or so. And now I'm on my 5th year or so of teaching 8th grade.
Wow. And, do you like that?
I'm still a fourth grade teacher. I miss fourth grade. That's the last, I feel like that's the last year that kids still draw pictures for their teacher.
Yeah.
But what's cool is like, being the 8th grade teacher, I haven't been the cool young teacher at my work in the longest time. So there's no pressure of trying to be cool and relating. I love being old and out of touch. I show up in my suspenders and bow. I look like the old guy from the movie Up. I wear suspenders with a bow tie. I got my glasses and I always got a coffee mug and I always just look like no, not good enough for me. And so I like being the grouchy old teacher with bad coffee breath. But I love it. I love teaching. Teaching. I love, it's like, ideally, I'd love to be able to reach all 35 of my students, but I know maybe 32 of them are just like going through the motions. They see the finish line. They see high school on the horizon. So it's so hard for them to get motivated to do anything right now.
Sure.
But it's cool. It's cool to just see what that generation has. If you work with junior high students, you get a chance to see what the future holds. And there's some pretty awesome young people out there, and they care about their world. They care about art. They care about being kind. They care about creating and making the world a better place. They're not as pessimistic and lazy as so many people think. This generation coming, I don't know what, I was Generation X. I don't know what this is. Generation whatever. I have
no idea.
They're not the millennial. Whatever.
Gen Z maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, Gen Z or whatever. I feel pretty good about our future, knowing that they're in charge, that they're going to be in charge.
Right. Well, and that's it's funny you bring that up because my kids are about that age. I have a 16 and a 14-year-old. The 14-year-old is in 8th grade, and then I have a 12-year-old who's in 6th grade, and I have a 4th grade boy who's turning 10 in June. And this has been my favorite age as a father because they're all becoming real people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually just recently said, I think I might have even said this on Facebook, but I wrote this a letter to my daughter, and I told her, I go, when you're a parent, it's not like you're parenting one person. You're parenting a person. You're one person, but you're a whole bunch of people as you grow up. You go from being a baby to a toddler, and then you're a young girl, and then you're you're an older girl, and then a preteen and a teen, and eventually you're going to be an adult. And the thing that's so crazy about it is you don't notice the transitions because you're there every day. And
Yeah.
so like, so then one day you just wake up and that person, that little kid that you loved is gone and this other
Yeah.
kid is here.
Yeah.
And you never really got a chance to say goodbye to that kid you loved. And so you're sitting here with this one and luckily I've loved every version of every one of my kids.
Oh.
You know, some more than others, but like but like, you know, it's just so crazy to sit there and think. I was just telling my son, he's a junior in high school, and I'm like, dude, you are like you got 1 year and you're gone. You know what I mean? I got you, and he's a, you know, I want you to meet him because he's a guitarist. He's a lead singer for his band. They call themselves Twisted Youth. They just
nice.
They just debuted at the Boardwalk. And
Wow. What
you know,
style of music do they play?
they're playing covers of rock music. So they did like
Okay.
they did like a Basket Case, and they did Sweet Child of Mine and a few other,
Okay.
you know, the Sweater Song from Weezer.
Well, every pro wrestler is doing covers of another wrestler's movie.
That's
so,
true.
You know,
That's true.
I have. It's not like, well, they're just covers. No, I mean, everyone's doing covers. Even when we write our own songs, we're just, you know, every song I write I'm ripping off the Ramones. So
Sure.
You know, I'm ripping off the Ramones or the Misfits. So it's all
Well,
that's awesome though.
Well, it's impressive though. It was funny because he, you know, I don't know how much he likes me talking about this stuff, but he's done he did like 5 or 6 shows, and I'd started. He didn't want me to go to the first one. He's like, please don't come, and I was like, all right, I won't. And so he was just so worried. And then I saw a couple of them, and boy, man, there was always something that went wrong in every one of the shows. And the last one he did before this, they really bit it. Like his guitar wasn't something was wrong with his guitar, and so they used a guitar that wasn't quite in tune, and then the drummer was kind of off, and it was bad. And I told him, I was like, hey man, look, even as a wrestler, man, you have stinkers. You know what I mean? There's, you know, everyone bombs every once in a while. And
does he know about your history and the DIY, you know, independent of you putting on shows, not just being a part of the show, but being on the production side? Does he know how involved you were?
Yeah. He was. I think he's the only. Well, no, the 2 older ones remember going to some of the shows.
Okay.
Funny thing about Austin, my oldest, he'll kill me for saying this, but we did TNA. We did TNA at the Memorial Auditorium, and he was probably 4. He hadn't really gotten into wrestling yet, you know. And so I brought him because I'm like, when I was 4, if I had a chance to hang out with wrestlers like, you know, Bubba Ray Dudley and Jeff Hardy and Rob Van Dam, like I would have peed my pants, right?
Oh yeah, it's like going to see Santa Claus.
Right. So he's there, and I have him there, and it's me and my dad and him, and he has no interest in anything going on. So I just give him my phone, and he's playing, and Bubba Ray Dudley walks up to him, and he's like, "Hey kid, how you doing? What are you playing?" He doesn't even look up from his phone. He's like, "I'm playing Angry Birds," and just doesn't. And Bubba Ray's just like, okay. And he just left. And now he looks back and he's like, I was such an idiot. Like now I would have loved that. You know
the most decorated tag team wrestler of all time came up and was trying to strike up conversation with me. But I think that's a cool thing that, you know, you can connect with them on, because there's so many similarities of independent music and independent wrestling, you know, that things don't always go the way they're supposed to go. And, you know, and there's those rough edges, and, you know, it's like, we would like the big production and the big showiness and the shininess of it all. But you know, there's a lot of charm and beauty to the rough edge independent side of both wrestling and music, when there's, you know, it's not all, you know, shiny and perfect. Those rough edges, those imperfections, I like that. I'm attracted to that, and I'm drawn into that.
Well, you know, that's what's so funny is that I think I did share with him the story of working big money, and I was like, yeah, man, it was my first match. He was a seasoned vet, and I crapped the bed. You know, like I did not do great, and I go, but you know what? The next match I worked Hustler for the championship, and it went really well. And so when we were at the Boardwalk, we're waiting for him to go up. And he comes up to me. He's like, "All right, so you got any motivational advice?" You know, I'm a try to motivate him all the time. So he's like, "You got anything motivational to say?" And I just looked at him and was like, "It's very important that you don't suck today." You know, and you know
that's kind of similar to the advice my wife gives me before any performance, whether it's wrestling or music. She uses a different phrase, but it's basically don't blank up.
Yeah,
that's her way of wishing me luck, and so that, yeah, it's like don't screw up, you know. But she doesn't use the word screw up, you know. She uses a different word.
but I gotta hand it to him though. When they got up on the at the boardwalk, man, they killed it. They killed it. I mean, he had little groupies coming up and talking to him afterwards and all that. I mean, he's got some talent, and But what was it? When did you start performing in music?
In music, it was I was always exposed to performing music because once again, growing up in a very traditional Mexican Catholic family. My father, before he became a deacon, he was the Spanish singing choir director. The Spanish choir basically consisted of my father singing, two people playing guitar, and a woman playing maracas. That was the choir. That was the Spanish Mass choir. But like Sunday Mass was basically us loading the PA in the car. So having to do road crew every Sunday for Mass. So it's like, Mass is at 12:30, but we got to start loading the car up at 11 to get to the Mass. As soon as the Mass before us is over, we got to set up, get the PA, do a quick sound check, and then I got to go to the back and put my altar boy robe on. And the whole production side of being a Catholic was, that got me ready for music. I remember I learned 3 chords on the guitar in 7th grade to impress a girl, and it didn't work. Then I learned the opening guitar riff to Jesse's Girl. And I remember playing it for her, and she's like, "What was that?" I'm like, "Nothing, never mind." And I put the guitar away. And every now and then in high school I'd bring it out, but not into it. And then in college, when I was at Sac State, I got involved in the local in the Sac State radio station, and I met a group of DJs who were playing music together. And so I started. They had a band, and one of the DJs was a guitarist, and he was like, Steve Vai kind of type of guitarist. And he unfortunately he was killed by a drunk driver.
Oh man!
And then at the funeral, one of the DJs was talking about their band and how, just reminiscing about how much fun it was. They never played shows; they just got together and jammed and all that. And then I remember talking to them after the funeral. It's like, hey, I have a guitar. If you guys ever want to if you're looking for someone to jam with, and we just started jamming together. I was maybe like 20 years old at the time, so I was a late bloomer. When I hear about people getting involved in the music scene now, they get started when they're 13 or so, and I'm like, I was a late bloomer. It wasn't until I was 20, and then we started this band. We called ourselves the Secretions. They already had that band name, and it just started up as a group of guys getting together and jamming in a living room. And for 25 years, we were a band, and we toured all over the U.S. We had songs in movies. Made videos. We went to Europe. We, toured all over, slept on floors. It sounds like Dusty Rhodes from I've slept on floors and wined and dined with kings and queens. But we slept on dirty punk rock floors on tours, and we've also got a chance to open up for My Chemical Romance and Papa Roach at Arco Arena.
Wow.
So it's like getting that experience was fantastic. So that's how I got into that. And that was a band that lasted 25 years, but it ran its course, and we didn't have a big ugly breakup. We just always said, when it's not fun anymore, we'll stop. And it got to that point, but we were in denial. I think we were all in denial for a few years of just like, but we're going to keep going because it's successful. We're playing these shows, we're getting these big show offers. We play the boardwalk, we're headlining the boardwalk, and there's hundreds of people there to see us. How can we say we're done?
Right.
But it just got to the point where it wasn't fun anymore, and it didn't. We had grown apart from each other. The two of us had been in the band for 25 years. The new guy was only in the band for 9 years. So but that's still a long time. And so, and the guy who was in the band for 9 years, he was the new guy. And so it's when you got three people creating and butting heads, and you know, and I probably wasn't the easiest guy to be in a band with. Because I'm in charge of this, I'm in charge of this, you can have this and this. You know, it's like I was very, very much a dictator when it came to that. You know, and looking back, I'm like, yeah, I could have been a lot easier to get along with, but I wasn't. And so we ended up kind of drifting apart. But I've played with other bands, and I had another band called the Knockoffs that still play every now and then with some of my best friends. The Moans started off as a little side project, and that became my primary band. And I've had the opportunity to take those guys on the road, and we record. We just let's see if I have it. No, somewhere in here. We just recorded our first full length on vinyl. You know, we recorded a couple of CDs, but like to have something on vinyl is a huge deal. So
yeah.
So
the picture.
And I've so as far as playing in the music scene, probably since 90, 91, I've been involved. You know, I did bands with my brother, and that's a hard thing to do, to be in a band with your own family, because like I said, you know, I can be a jerk when it comes to being in a band. You know, it has to be this way. Shut up, I know what I'm talking about. You know, it's like, and we can butt heads, and so.
But those tend to be when you get, just from what I've heard and what I've seen. I mean, you think about going back to wrestling, like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were butting heads all the time and had some of the best matches ever. Yeah. So, you know, sometimes that breeds a different level of creativity.
Yeah, but they were also making mortgage payments with what they were doing.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point.
With punk rock, we were happy if we were making gas money. You know, and once again, with music and wrestling, you don't make your money off the promoter, you make it at the merchandise table.
Right.
And so we weren't, you know, it got to the point where it's like, you know, I'm spending weeks, you know, I'm on tour, spending weeks, if not a month away from my home and from my wife, and just to argue and just to butt heads and just to be irritated and be irritating. You know, it's not worth it. It wasn't worth it. It's like I want to have fun. I want to enjoy what I'm doing. And so, you know, and that's not to blame anyone. It's just the way it was. You know, you can't expect to be in a band for 25 years that's just making gas money and still, you know, have that same love and passion that, you know, you had the first time you jammed. You know, I'm sure it can happen, but it just didn't happen with us.
Right. Well, and also, you know, I mean, I think you're right in the way that, you know, I'm an attorney, and I know a lot of attorneys who have made a ton of money but are just miserable human beings. Yeah. You know what I mean? And they're just completely unhappy doing it. And luckily, I have a passion for what I do, so it's easy, and luckily it pays well, you know, so that's nice. But yeah, you know, there is a point where you just have to find something meaningful. And if it's not meaningful anymore, you know, you move on. And it sounds like that's what you did.
And I feel like that with teaching too. It's like, I know a lot of teachers who are miserable and who just complain the entire time. No, teaching's hard. Teaching is not, you know, when you're dealing with students who maybe don't realize that you want to see them do better. And they think that you're just there to make their day miserable. You know, it's kind of tough. Or, you know, when we don't get paid very well, but still, it's like, it's something I love, and I love making that connection in the classroom, whether I was teaching second grade or teaching fourth grade or eighth grade. It's awesome making those connections, and the same thing with music and with wrestling. It's making connections, and you know, it's like, the money is nice if you can get it, but if you're not making the connections and doing it with people that you care about, what's the point? Yeah, you know. And with wrestling, the group of people that I get to work with now, through Action Coast, through Total Wrestling Federation, through Next Level, Lucha Extreme, Lucha Patron, and that group of people, they're just there's such a great positive force of creativity, and I enjoy that time. I enjoy getting to spend that time around them, and I always come back, even if I'm beaten and bruised, feeling, you know, spiritually refreshed just being around these people. The guys that I play music with now, with the Moans and with the Knockoffs, I just, you know, I come back from band practice and just with the biggest smile on my face because I'm hanging out with the best friends that I have. And the same thing with teaching. You know, it's like my favorite part of teaching is when I'm in the classroom with those students. My least favorite times are when I'm in the staff room listening to other teachers complain. I'm like, I don't want to be around that. You know, so sometimes I just sit in my room alone. I put on a podcast and I just eat lunch in my room because I don't want to be around that negativity. I'd rather just sit back and, you know, I don't mind telling the kids, hey, keep it down. Hey, pay attention, you know, because every now and then, you know, they do pay attention and you get to see this glimmer into what the future is. And it's pretty awesome. You know, this 8th grade class I have right now is probably my favorite class that I've ever taught.
Wow. That's awesome. I was going to ask you, you know, now that you've been a teacher for 30 years, tell me, you know, you hear, you know, you get old timers and you get all these people who are just worried for the future, right? They're like, oh, look at the kids nowadays. They're doing all this stuff. And I think some of the worries may be legitimate, but I mean, I'm sure the generation before us were thinking the same thing. So could maybe talk about how have kids changed in your mind over the last 30 years?
I think the biggest change I've seen is that I have less and less that I can actually relate to, and that's okay. And I think it's like when I first started teaching, you know, I was 24 years old. I was the cool teacher, you know, and I was the one with the guitars in the class. I was the rock and roll teacher. Oh, he's the one who wears the Converse All Stars and spikes his jet black hair, you know, and my jet black hair came in a tube of hair dye, but. I think the thing that's changed is like as I've gotten older, I have less and less that we connect to each other on. But then at the same time, you know, I got one of my favorite students. He comes, I absolutely adore this kid. He's like, hey, Mr. Reynoso, I want to show you something that I brought from home. He reaches into his hoodie, he brings out a Walkman, a cassette Walkman.
Nice.
And I'm like, please say there's a tape in there. It's like, oh yeah, it's a really good one too. Pulls out the tape. I have no idea. It's an old In Excess tape.
Oh wow, nice.
And I'm like, do you actually listen? It's like, yeah, I love this song. And so it's like, granted, he's listening to oldies in his mind. I'm listening to stuff that I listened to in high school.
Right.
But I think the biggest change that I've seen in kids over these 30 years is that they're a lot more aware of their surroundings than older generations give them credit for. They just may not be acting the way that you want them to act, but they know what's going on. They know what's right and what's wrong, and they get upset at things that they should get upset at, and there's more kids that are willing to stand up for what's right than not. And so maybe I'm a little too Pollyanna about it, but I really do have a lot of faith in this generation, whatever the name of the generation of kids that's between 8th grade and high school, whatever that generation is. I've got all the kids that I've taught in 8th grade. I think my first class that I taught in 8th grade just graduated high school last year, but that whole generation of young people, they're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay.
Do you teach specific subjects then?
Social studies, literature, language arts. They have a different teacher who comes in and does. I teach at a Catholic school, so they have a different teacher who comes in and teaches religion, different teacher who teaches math and science. But I teach social studies. So in social studies, we're talking about early American history. And kind of showing them how things really haven't changed. You know, when John Adams, before he left the presidency, he tried to stack the Supreme Court. let's fast forward.
Yeah,
Later on in the 21st
Right.
century, when the same thing and so we kind of talk about the similarities, and sometimes kids are interested, sometimes not. Then in literature, we're reading Lord of the Flies right now,
Oh
and
wow.
I
Yeah,
just
that's a good
assigned the
one.
chapter where Piggy is killed. So
Oh yeah.
we'll see how that
Yeah.
goes over. Sorry for
Yeah.
anyone watching if that's a spoiler.
Yeah.
And then language art, just basically trying to teach them how to convey the thoughts in a legible manner.
You know, it's funny you bring that up because I remember my son. You know, I talk about him so much on these podcasts, but like he came home one day and he told me, or maybe we were driving somewhere, and he said something along the lines of like, God, they just have all these papers they need me to write and all these things, and I'm just so sick of it. And I remember saying to him like, do you understand why they ask you to write? Do you understand? Do you think they're just trying to make you like,
Yeah.
they're trying to make your life difficult? No, it's because the people who write and speak and can formulate a thought and put it down, like those are the people that change the world,
Yeah.
like I go, it's people like Martin Luther King who says, I have a dream and can speak that articulately that changes the world, or
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence
Yeah.
changes everything. And it goes, so when your teacher's signing this stuff to you, is because he's trying to train you, because you could be the next one to change the world,
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I don't think that gets taught a lot from those people that complain all the time.
Yeah, and I try and let my kids know, it's like, hey, you have this opportunity to make your mark.
Yeah.
Whether it's through music, whether it's through art, whether it's through literature, no matter what, you have an opportunity. That don't and it's not something that's specifically just for younger people. It's like you look at all the great classical music out there, and then you find out that these composers were in their 50s and 60s when they wrote these pieces that have lasted hundreds of years.
Right.
So the window for creativity isn't just for the kids.
Right.
It's a message for the old farts like me. It's like that window is still wide open. There's no timestamp on when you're allowed to create and leave your mark out there in the world.
Well,
and
I think people forget too that you can, I've tried to tell all of my kids too that it's okay to fail, like it's okay. You just have to be right one time.
Yeah.
One time,
Right.
and that's like you mentioned your bands, like, oh, well, 25 years in Gas Money. Well, yeah, okay, but now you're with the Moans, and that could strike it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You never know. I mean,
yeah.
So
well, and then the other thing with Secretions, how many times people would come up to me and say, "Yeah, my first punk rock show was seeing you guys," and it's like they speak to that the same way that you were talking about seeing the British Bulldogs versus the Dream Team,
right.
The way that I would talk about seeing Playboy Buddy Rose versus Tito Santana,
right?
And it's like, and they're talking about their first punk rock show, and we're talking about our first wrestling show, and those are moments that we created. It's like, and I don't take that for granted or just dismiss it just because that band's no longer together, or we don't talk to each other, we're not a band anymore. So I don't dismiss, that moment that band had an opportunity to create for some people, and I hope that I got to meet Playboy Buddy Rose once later on, and
nice.
And I hope that he knows how important that moment was when he told me to shut up because I called him a big fatty head.
Yeah.
And how I was just like, my 7-year-old self was just like, oh, this giant just told me to shut up. And I remember telling him that story, and he was like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, no. You created a memory that lasted a lifetime, and you taught me everything about professional wrestling that night, and how powerful it is, and how awesome it is, and how you have that opportunity. There's not a single time that I don't step out through the curtain and don't think of that I don't think that, like, you have that opportunity to create a lifelong memory. And what a great gift that is. And no matter what you're doing, it's like that match that you had with Big Money that you said, you crapped the bed, whatever. Guess what? There was probably some kid in that audience who saw their first wrestling show and they remember that match, or they remember whatever. And maybe you don't want them to remember that match, but still, they might remember a completely different match than you did. You have that opportunity to create that memory. Your son's got that opportunity playing music to create that memory for someone that's going to last a lifetime. And that's, I don't know, to me, that's what's really special.
Isn't that interesting too? You know, I remember my dad and I, we went up to Tahoe years back, 5-6 years ago. You know, there was some guy running a show that the Reno boys were helping with, you know, Chupi and Luster and those guys. And anyway, they had done this whole big signing thing. They had been working with Kirk White, so they got all these names out there. And the two people that I remember, they had Jake the Snake there, and they had Bret Hart there, and they had Brutus Beefcake there, the Warlord. Like, they had a bunch of people. But what really struck me was I get to tell Brutus Beefcake, I mean, like, you were my first match, and I remember at that time, and specifically, like, I was really young, but things weren't going super great for my family, you know, at that point. And, you know, my dad and I weren't on super great terms yet, you know? And I was like, and that was a memory that we had together. You know, wrestling was a memory we had together. You were like the guy, you know, that started that. And then that same time, my dad, so I've shared this publicly before, but my dad is 25 years sober. He was a drug, he had an addiction issue, and he has completely changed his life and has done great. But I think I was my senior year in high school, maybe senior year. He was in rehab, and Bret Hart was doing a signing at the Arco Arena, and my mom went there, and I remember at the time I was really mad because they only would sign one thing, right? And so I can't remember who she got me. I don't even have it anymore, but she got Bret Hart to sign for my dad and told him where he was, and he wrote this really nice note on it, and my dad got it. So when we went to that thing, my dad took that to him and said, I'm 25 years sober, you know, or 20 years sober at the time. He goes, I want you to know how much this meant to me. And to him, it was just another, you know, Tuesday. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of effect, I think, I don't know, you know, there's a quote I heard that says, societies go great when men plant trees, the shade of which they're never going to sit in. And I don't, you know, we all have those moments. You know what I mean? We all have those moments where who knows if Bret Hart had been having a bad day. I don't know if it would have had any effect on my dad's recovery or not. You know what I mean? But thinking about that just signing his name there and saying something nice when all he was doing was signing named everybody else, and he actually put something really special to my dad. That meant something. And so I think that experiences like that sometimes color the way I treat people, you know?
Yeah.
And so
you can't take it for granted. You never know the connection that you're going to make with someone. And, you know, it's like, looking back, I wish I treated people differently. I wish I appreciated people more when I had the opportunity. But all I can do is the regret of, I wish I did things differently, or I wish I treated people differently, or I appreciated people differently back then. The only thing I can do is have that impact how I treat people now, and how much I appreciate people now. And I think taking the time to look back on things like that, it's really important to look back on your own life and think like, okay, where I've been, where I've been, what I've done, what I wish I could have done differently, but that's just the way things are. But how can that impact what I'm doing today, what I'm going to be doing this weekend or next weekend? You know, that's all we can do, is just let our past kind of not define us, but help guide us in where we are today. And I think that's a great gift that, you know, whether it meant a lot to Bret Hart or not, that's still a great gift to say, hey, you did this little thing and that made big impact on me. Maybe that kind of, for a brief second there, Bret Hart probably thought, wow, you know, I do have that ability to lift someone's spirits, you know, just by signing my name, just by being the hitman, Bret Hart, at one of these autograph signings, you know, I'm sure it's just like, okay, signing, give me my paycheck. But then to realize, wow, you know, you do have that opportunity to make those connections there.
Yeah, and you don't have to, you know, I think the thing is interesting is you don't have to be Bret Hart. I mean, you know, I did an earlier podcast with a young man, his name's Sonny Smith, and I've known him since he was 12 years old. We went to church together. I was on charge of the men's group when he was there preparing to go on a mission for the church, and there when he came back. And he came on the podcast to share his story about he has gender dysphoria, and so he's transgender. He believes that he should have been born a woman, and he shared the story coming from his earliest age, and it's a long podcast, like 3 hours long, but he told the whole story, and he talked about how when he told certain people how they treated him and how other people treated him, how he went to the military for a while, how he was treated there, and all these different things. And then he told me he decided to transition into being a woman, and then decided that wasn't right for him and went back to being a man, and just the struggle he had gone through. And he had some other mental health issues too. And but I remember thinking after I ended the podcast and just kind of reflecting on what I just heard, I was like, I've known this guy since he was 12 years old, and I never knew. I never knew he had that war going on in his head. You know what I mean? And I was like, and then I started thinking, because I would teach lessons at church, and I would sit there and I'd think to myself, I'm like, if I had known he was sitting there, and if I had known he was dealing with this, I might have taught that differently. It had a profound effect on me, because I'm like, why do I have to know to teach it differently? You know? And I was just like, you know, who knows? You could be talking to somebody, and everyone's going to have a bad day. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to be nice to everybody. And quite frankly, there's people, if I saw them today, I wouldn't be nice to them. But like, you never know when somebody's teetering on the edge. And just you know, they're just dying for an encouraging word. You know? It's just,
and I think that was a recent episode, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was probably about a month, 4 or 5 episodes ago.
Okay. I remember.
He's an impressive guy. I don't think I've had anybody come on more vulnerable than him, because he was so honest, and he spoke at the end to other members of my church, you know, being a member of the Mormon church, who might be dealing with the same issue, and was really great. You know, those are the best podcasts, the ones where people come on like, and they just are honest and vulnerable about, you know, you get some people on there that are a little guarded, you know, and so they're real careful about what they're saying. Another thing that was interesting about just talking about podcasting is the last podcast I did was with this guy John, who he's well, I don't know. I came away not quite knowing how he would identify sexually. He's somewhere in between bisexual and gay, but he's Mormon. And if you know anything about the church, you know, that doesn't quite jive, you know? And he shared, it was funny because he shared his story, and, you know, he was married to a woman, and then there was some infidelity with men. And so she divorced him, and he has some addiction issues and things like that. And he ended up, you know, he's married again to another woman, and working all that out, I guess, in his head. But the thing that I found so funny is that I noticed that there were certain parts of the story, I don't think it came across in the podcast, but there were certain parts of the story where I found my own biases based on what he was saying bothered me. You know, like I was not super stoked with the way he was talking about it. And I you know, particularly when it came to, you know, his divorce, and kind of, I felt like he was maybe blaming the wife a little bit, like, you know, for leaving him. And I was like, well, you're gay, you know? You know? And so I was a little upset. And then when he talked about the addiction, you know, some of the issues he had were relating to porn addiction, I was a little bothered by some of the things he said there. And I remember afterwards, I had kind of a visceral reaction afterwards, like, this guy, these things he said, I wasn't a big fan of. And then I realized, I was like, you know what? It's not fair of me to put my biases on him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know his story or where
Yeah.
John is coming from. I don't know what it's like to be a member of the LGBTQ community as a
Mm-hmm.
Mormon and how that fits. If I'm going to ask all these people to listen to my podcast and listen to all these variety of different people with an open mind and try to understand where people are coming from, I got to do the same thing,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but that's what I love about this podcast is that I get to have people like you on and have, and hear like your influences and how cool it is. Like, I just think the reason I wanted you on was because it's so cool that you are so multifaceted. You know what I mean?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
that's a nice way of saying I spread myself pretty thin.
No, I know how that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know how that goes, but it's just so fun to watch you going back to that show in 2003 ish. The other thing I remember about El Flaco Loco was there was a little group of kids there, and and Flaco was right in the middle of those kids cheering on all the other wrestling matches. And I just thought, I was like, you know what, that's cool, because a lot of the wrestlers, they wouldn't go out there and cheer for all the other guys. You know what I mean? Like, get all stoked about it, and you were just right there, and I just love that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an experience. It's the experience of it all, and I don't know. I don't know how much time we have, but when you were advertising for this podcast, you mentioned my health my health adventure of being a brain tumor survivor, and I think dealing with that it was the toughest thing for my jaded punk rock heart to deal with, because it turned me into a hippie, for lack of a better term. It made me really stop to pause and was like, wow, life is really, really precious. And when the type of brain tumor I have, it's called an acoustic neuroma, and it's a non-cancerous tumor, but it does grow. And the type of radiation therapy that I had to stop the tumor from growing, it's not chemo, but it's pinpointed radiation that just stops the tumor from growing. So the tumor's still in there, and it's still inside my skull. And I go in every year for an MRI to just see if it's growing or not, and if it is continuing to grow, then they have to go in for surgery, and that can be, brain surgery is no laughing matter. But point being, when I was dealt with that, and that was a tough deal for me, because I lost my father to brain cancer, and so when I hear brain tumor, I'm like, oh, I think even though it's not cancerous, the brain cancer community welcomed me in. I felt like I was dealing with kind of I shouldn't be complaining about my journey when I have this person who's going through something much more dangerous than, they have brain cancer. I have a brain tumor. It's not cancer. It's benign, but it's still, it could still be fatal.
Sure.
But I felt like I was dealing with false valor, kind of. But the brain cancer community was so welcoming and so supportive. And they basically said, "No, you're one of us. You're one of the cool kids now, Danny." And so my friend Liz, who was just such an amazing source of support, and it was one of those things that it made me stop to really appreciate what I got, appreciate what I've had, and the opportunities I've had, the adventure that I've had in this life, and just and it really makes me wish, man, I wish I can go back and just, not that I don't know if I would do things differently, but I would just appreciate things more, and I would appreciate the people. And there's so many people I'd want to go back and thank and give them a hug and just say, thank you for this, thank you for that. And I felt like in the past, maybe I took too much for granted and I didn't really appreciate it. But there's nothing wrong with looking back and appreciating what you have, but it's a much better feeling of appreciating what's right in front of you.
Yeah.
And so, fortunately I have that with wrestling, and I still have that with music. I have that with teaching in the classroom. I have that with with I have that with a wife who puts up with me.
Yeah.
It's just like appreciating what I have, and I think when you're dealt the cards of with like a brain tumor, where you're like, well, who knows what next year is going to look like? Who knows where I'm going to be? What my health is going to be? What condition I'm going to be in? So I better appreciate what I've got right now, and appreciate the people that I get to be around. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing.
Do you still have any symptoms that are associated with the tumor?
Yeah. So I've lost all hearing on the right side. I pretty much for the past. I was diagnosed with this 7 years ago. 7 years ago, and I deal with a headache 24 hours a day, and so I've had a headache for the past 7 years. But you get used to it. Even though I'm deaf in my right ear, there's a constant ringing, and it always feels like when you get water in your ear, it always feels like that. So it always feels like I want to get water out of my ear. Balance. I deal with balance issues, so sometimes the wrestling training and wrestling moves, I can get disoriented because I lose balance fairly easily. Like
you do enough of those rolls, no matter what. Yeah, you can get sick.
I mean, and you do the training at Manticore, and it's like you do a couple of when I do a couple of rolls, or when I'm helping train and having students do a couple of rolls, and I want to show them, all right, here's how I want you to go into it, and I get up and I'm like, whoa, where am I for a second? So a few times, so balance. Hearing, headaches, that's pretty much what I'm dealing with now. Yeah. And that's a lot. It's a lot. And but like I said, I go in for MRIs. It used to be every 6 months. Now it's every year. And they just measure the tumor to see if there's been any growth. And so far, for the past 7 years since I did the radiation, it's been at bay. It has not grown at all.
What was the first sign to you that you had something going on? What got you to go to the doctor for it?
The loss of hearing. Loss of hearing. My wife telling me you need to go get hearing aids and I attribute it, years of playing loud punk rock music without, I'm not going to put earplugs in. That's a cheater way of doing it. Right. That's the way I thought. So I thought that I just lost my hearing. I felt like I went to a Motorhead concert, but only in my right-hand side. Right. So when they went in to do the hearing testing, they said, I'm like, all right, I don't care if I get a hearing aid, or whatever, And they said, well, if your hearing was gone, it should be gone on both sides. And on your left side, hearing's still pretty good. Right side, it's not good at all. So they wanted to do an MRI to see if there's anything going on. And that's when they discovered the tumor. And I had, at that point in my life, I had already lost my father to brain cancer. So when I heard brain tumor, I just felt the worst.
How long did it take before you learned it wasn't cancerous?
Right away, when I found out the type of tumor it was. But I mean, you hear brain tumor, you think cancer, but there's so many different there's so many different types of tumors, and this type of tumor, it's benign, but because a tumor is benign doesn't mean it doesn't grow or that it's not bad. Right. It grows, and if it grows to the point where it causes too much pressure, it can be fatal. And there have been people who've died of acoustic neuromas or vestibular schwannomas, whatever. Anything that ends in oma is bad.
Not good.
So naturally, I went through a really dark period of depression, and I tried to document it all in these little video blogs. And I go back and I watch, and it's hard for me to watch that dark period of my life where I just really felt like, well, what's the purpose? Why even try anymore? My life is completely changed. It's going to be different now. And fortunately, I've gotten through that, and thankfully to some wonderful scientists at Stanford University, a method of delivering radiation to pinpoint a tumor to stop that tumor from growing was developed here in California. And prior to that, the way that they would administer the radiation is they would drill holes in your head and attach this big metal ring, and they would administer the radiation that way. But fortunately, they didn't have to do that. thankfully it's called the cyberknife therapy, and so yeah, thankfully, I thank God for the wonderful scientists and doctors and science nerds and science geeks that developed this method to treat brain tumors. And so I've always felt like when I got to the point where I can talk about my own brain tumor story, that if someone out there feels like, hey, well, this guy's still doing X, Y, and Z, even though he's dealing with this, that if that can just maybe be just a small source of inspiration, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a couple questions about that. What was it that pulled you out of the dark place?
I mean, initially my wife, knowing that no matter what, she was going to be there. I think finding something within myself, just saying, you know what, this is the cards I'm dealt with, and I just have to keep living my life. I have to, the brain tumor has to live with me. I don't have to live with the brain tumor. And it was just, I think I had to go through that dark period to get through. You have to go through that hallway, that dark hallway, to get to the door that leads to the outdoors. And I had to go through that. And I think it was taking the time. I stopped feeling sorry for myself, and I took the time to start appreciating what I had. Number one is that I've got the most solid rock of a wife that I could ever have hoped to have. I'm one of those guys who married up, and she was the biggest source that got me through it. And then taking the time to really go, not giving up on music, not giving up on wrestling, not giving up on teaching, and just approaching it with a new passion. And it's like, you never know how long I can be able to do this. You never know. Who knows where I'm going to be next year with this? Who knows what's going to happen? And so I may as well appreciate what I have. And I think just doing a 180, or stop feeling sorry for myself, and instead of doing why me, I'm like, okay, this is what I've dealt. These are the cards I've dealt with. Make the best of it.
Yeah. So, can you pinpoint anything in particular that helped you get there, where you're like, you know what, these are the cards I'm just going to deal with it? Did it just all of a sudden snap one day, or was there something that pulled you out of it?
I think I think it's still up online. I had a website called braintumorfighter.com, and I had these video blogs, and I was putting blogs up pretty regularly, and then I stopped. So I think the last update I did was like 3 or 4 years ago. I think going back and documenting that, and then going back and watching and seeing, I'm not there anymore. I'm not that sad. I'm in a better place now. And I think looking back and seeing how low I was, and realizing I'm not that low anymore, that means I'm on the upswing. And I think that was really important. It's like why it's important to keep a journal, why it's important to document things, and like write things down, either write things down or record yourself just talking. And it was just me talking to my computer monitor, and just, I don't know why I was doing it. Maybe I was thinking maybe I can reach someone. And I actually made a connection with a gentleman who had the same type of brain tumor in Australia, and I did an interview with him, and we had talked to each other. And I don't know why, I just felt like documenting it.
Yeah.
And I think going back and watching it. So if I had to pinpoint, maybe it was the time that I just sat there and I rewatched some of my old video blogs, and I just realized I'm in a better place right now, and I'm happier. I'm more I'm just more content, and I'm more accepting of what my life is.
And do you think that experience has helped you with this idea of living in the moment and doing those things? I mean,
I do.
Yeah.
And it sounds, 7 years ago, I never would have said this, but having a brain tumor has been the biggest blessing of my life. It really has, and, I always, when they say God has a reason,
Yeah.
God has a reason for everything. And it's like 7 years ago, why this?
Right.
Why am I dealing with this?
Yeah.
This is why, because you had all these great experiences in your life. You've traveled all over. You've done so much. You've got to do things with minimal talent. 3 chords on the guitar, 1 beat on drums, and you've got this opportunity to travel all over and meet so many people and play on so many stages. You're very limited, but you've had an opportunity to do so much in the world of wrestling. And I think a greater power said, hey, you need a reality check of just how blessed you've been. Mm-hmm. And maybe you need this little bump in the road to stop and take a look around. I was driving down that highway. I need that bump in the road to stop and go, wow, look at the scenery. Look at everything around me. Look at this weather. Look at the beautiful landscape. Mm-hmm. And I really do think, it was a blessing.
Yeah.
It was a curse at first, but then I think realizing it's a blessing, and it's let me realize that, not every, all those things like tomorrows aren't guaranteed. It's like sometimes you need a bump in the road to realize that.
That's you struck a chord with me. And that's I really appreciate you saying all that, because it's really easy. It's not easy. I guess what I'm saying is I've noticed in my own life, whenever I was going through something really difficult, mm-hmm. I've always come out of it, and looking back, I'm like, man, that thing really needed to happen to put me in such a better position than I was beforehand, right?
Yeah.
But then when you're in something that's dark, you can't see mm-hmm. that light, and there is just a level of faith where you got to take that leap out into the darkness mm-hmm. and just hope that my aunt one time said, it's like you trust God and you jump out into the darkness and find that there's a feather bed,
Yeah.
And so I'm sure, a lot of my friends that struggle, and I struggle quite a bit at times, and there's somebody probably listening to this that's going through something, and it's easy to say, but mm-hmm. when you go through it, just know that there's just as sure as the night comes, so does mm-hmm. the light,
Exactly.
And so it's and when it does, you'll look back. I had a person tell me one time in a blessing, say, one day you'll look back on all your footsteps and realize that everything was overruled for your best good. And I've believed that, mm-hmm. Everything that's happened, we all have those things in our past that happened to us that we had no control mm-hmm. over.
Yeah.
And how we react to it is so important. So it sounds like you've reacted beautifully.
Well, like I said, I think there was a reason why I was blessed with this brain tumor. Yeah. And it, like I said, 7 or 8 years ago, I saw it as a curse. Mm-hmm. And now I see it as a blessing because of the outlook it's given me towards life. And I still screw up. I still take things for granted. But I'd like to think that I'm better at appreciating things mm-hmm. than I was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
In the classroom, on the stage with the guitar in my hand, or on the stage sitting behind a drum set, or jumping around a squared circle in spandex. But most importantly, on the wrestling side of things, and I'm sure you can relate to this, sitting in that locker room.
Yeah.
Because that's when the beauty of a wrestling show. That's what the beauty of a wrestling show really is in that locker room. The camaraderie, the laughter, the jokes, the creativity. Yeah. It's only a small group of people who like wrestling or involved with wrestling know what that's like. And I feel like I really could have done a better job of appreciating what I had, back in 2000. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, I'm working at a place that does shows in that same building, and that vibe is just the same. And
you get to appreciate it now.
Boy, I do, and I do appreciate the guys and girls that are involved with all of the wrestling that I've done for the past 3 years, where I've come back and been involved. I sure do appreciate them.
Yeah. Real quick before we wrap up, I want to talk about your cancer benefit shows. So
Yes.
you do that yearly, right?
Yeah, every year for my birthday, it's called the F Cancer Series,
Right.
and I know that limits the amount of promotion that I'm able to do by calling it that. I started doing it a long time ago. I just wanted to do a birthday show for myself at this venue called the Capitol Garage a long time ago, and so I rented out the Capitol Garage and I did a birthday show for myself. Where I had a bunch of my friends' bands play, and it was just I wanted to make a free show, so I paid for the venue, paid for the sound, and I just wanted people to come party for free. And then I wanted to do it again the next year. And then what had happened is a friend of mine who was a very pivotal person in my upbringing in the local music scene. His name is Jay Oniskin. Mm-hmm. He had been diagnosed with cancer. And so I wanted to do this as a benefit show for him. He was living in Japan at the time. And so, hey, get a few bands together. We can raise like $300 or $400 and I'll send it over to Jay so he can take care of medical bills or whatever. And so we decided to call it F Cancer, and I made a little flyer that we gave out at shows that talked about Jay and why we're raising this money. And then every year we would start doing it. They were just little fundraisers for my friend Jay. And then I started doing them for the American Cancer Society. Just started doing these fundraisers because they started getting bigger and bigger. And so it's like, hey, we're making a couple $1,000s. Let's we'll send it to the American Cancer Society. And then when my father was diagnosed with cancer, I definitely wanted to keep calling it F Cancer because I was really upset. And, and people ask, why don't you call it something else? I'm like, no, because seriously, F Cancer. And there's a group in Los Angeles that has that name, and it's not associated with it. I just call the shows that just because it's been such a cathartic experience to like do these shows and have people come up to me and tell me their cancer. So, tell me, I lost my mom to cancer. I lost my brother to cancer. I lost my dad to cancer. And it's kind of like a cool celebration for them. And at some of the shows, I'll get like a couple of poster boards and people can write messages or bring pictures and put them up there, and just like a little memorial board. And it's one of the crummy things is we all have a cancer story. We all have a cancer story. We have all been affected by someone with cancer. And we've all been affected by losing someone or having a friend who has lost someone to cancer. And so those shows are it's a great way for me to celebrate my birthday. It's the first week of November. I just do a series of shows. I'm thinking this year, my friend Keith Lowell Jensen, who that'd be a great person for you to have as a guest. Boy, that guy's hilarious. I want to get him and Dave Touchstone to do one of the nights to be a comedy night, so stand-up comedy. Yeah. And then usually have bands shows, and then who knows? Maybe I can talk to Action Coast and Next Level and Total Wrestling.
Do a wrestling
and get
show.
all those. Do a big super show. They just did one down the Central Valley with a bunch of like 4 promotions. Yeah. And we can do one up here and do it as a part of the fundraiser. Yeah. So then get Manticore to come out there.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Do that. That'd be fun.
Absolutely, that would be fun.
So it's just been something. It's just been something I enjoy doing for my birthday. Just putting together shows and raising money for the American Cancer Society. And it started off as just getting together with friends, and then it evolved into raising some money for a friend, and then raising some money for an organization that I really believe in. And then I think about my dad every year that I do it.
That's great. Wow. Yeah. Well, listen, I want to ask you a couple of questions I ask everybody before we take off.
All right. I'm ready.
First question, what would you say is your biggest success?
My biggest success. I would say this is going to be kind of weird. One of my coworkers is a former student of mine.
Oh, wow.
I would say that's one of my business, and I never if Mr. Perot sees this, it's like he's one of my biggest successes. And I don't really. And it's like he's my kid's math teacher, and he was one of my former students. So knowing that like some of my students turned out to be pretty awesome people. I I've other students who are involved in music, involved in film. I've got a couple of my former students who are independent filmmakers.
That's awesome.
So I think I'd say Mr. Pro is an example. So I think my biggest success is seeing my former students just kick butt.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what do you think, would you say is your biggest failure, and what did you learn from it?
My biggest failure, I think going back to what I was saying, taking a lot of things for granted, going back and just realizing, man, how many people can say they've toured the U.S. 5 or 6 times only knowing how to play one beat on the drums, or knowing only how to play 3 chords on the guitar? How many people can say they were flown to Europe to do a full European tour, only playing 3 chords on the guitar, or flown to Hawaii, or flown or played Mexico twice, or gone all over Canada with very little? Or how many people can say, yeah, I've wrestled in front of 1,000 people, and I can not very athletic.
Yeah.
So I think my biggest failure is just, not my biggest failure was my pre-brain tumor. Of just like not really appreciating things.
Yeah. So last question that I have. So everybody at some day is going to pass away. We hope it's, 30 years from now for you, or something like that, 30, 40, however long it takes. And when that happens, there'll be a funeral and someone will give a eulogy. What's the one thing that you hope someone would say in your eulogy?
He wasn't as much of a jerk as you might think. I like to come across as a grouch and kind of pessimistic and jerk like that. But I don't know. I would like it if someone said, you know what, I was having a really crummy day, and he made my day a little better just by being who he was.
Well, you know what's funny? I'll tell you this, Danny. You'll appreciate this. There are not a lot of people in wrestling that you can say this about, but you are one of them, and that is that I have never heard anyone say a bad word about you.
Oh, you just don't know enough people, Josh.
No, I mean it. Like
I appreciate that.
Everybody I've talked to, the people that I think of when I think about this is I think of El Flaco Loco and I think of Virgil Flynn. Those are the 2 guys who literally, I remember, in fact, I even remember one wrestler, I'll just say who it was. It was Maynard Skinner, telling me one time, he said, you know what? He goes, I think he said he was at either DMW or SPW or something. And he goes, it's one of my first shows. And he said, and Flaco shows up, and he just shows up with a case of beer, puts it in the front, or puts it in the locker room, and just let everybody know after the show we're all friends and we're going to share that beer. And he goes, and it meant so much to me because nobody was really being nice to me, at the time, and Flaco was. And that's the type of stories that I hear about El Flaco Loco, is that, when everybody else is being a dick, because wrestling is full of them. You know what I mean? Yeah. Everybody thinks that they're Hulk Hogan, and I've never heard a bad word. And you've always been super respectful, even when I was starting SWF and SPW was around, and the people at SPW weren't necessarily super stoked about SWF being around. You were always super respectful to me, and I always felt like you were approachable, and I could talk to you, and I really appreciated that. So.
Well, I'll pass that message to Flaco, and I'm sure he'll be very appreciative of it. When I got married, I had educators, musicians, family members, and wrestlers at the reception. And my wife always said, your musician friends love you and all that. Your family loves you. She's like, but there's something about your wrestling friends. It's like they love you, and that they will travel to the ends of the world for you, and it's not just for me. They will do that for everyone. And there's just there's something, I don't know, you can't put it into words, just that connection of friends that I've made in the wrestling world that like I would do anything for them, and I know they would do anything for me. And like at a drop of a hat, you know, there's been times where like even Big Ugly and I, maybe we haven't been getting along, but if I called him at 2 a.m, he would be right at my doorstep there to help me out. And he knows the same thing, that I would do the same thing for him. Yeah. And those are connections that I'm sure people make in lots of aspects of their life. But for me, wrestling is where I made those connections. And yeah, just I guess if when I die, I'm just hoping someone says, he wasn't that bad of a guy.
Yeah. Well, you definitely you'll hear a lot. I'm sure there'll be a lot more than that. And so, well, listen, Danny, it has been great. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with me.
I appreciate this.
The coolest thing about this podcast is I get to have really cool, connected conversations with people that I've respected, and you're one of them. And so,
thank you, Josh.
I gotta say, I'll tell you a regret I have, and that is that I when I was running SWF never got a chance to book El Flaco Loco. And so
maybe you just didn't have it in the funds, you know. He's one of those, he's one of those guys, you know, if he's got a certain set amount, you know, promoter's got to cough up the money.
It wasn't that I couldn't afford his handler. You needed a handler. And,
yeah, right. You know, the bar tab, the rider, the beer tab. It's like, dude, where do we get all that booze? You know?
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing you backstage at a wrestling show soon.
Yeah, absolutely. We will. We definitely will. Anyway, all right, man. Well, I'm supposed to tell people to subscribe. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the podcast. And thanks, Danny Reynoso, for coming on. And you can check out. You can buy the Moans album and come to Action Coast Wrestling or Next Level Pro and check out El Flaco Loco. Good friends with Danny.
Yeah.
And
good
so
neighbor of mine.
Yeah. And we'll see you guys all soon.
All right.